What is this? Hamas is a mission, and in writing, it has to take it back, the Holy Land, spread the Muslim faith, and wipe out all the opposition. It's super radical, and I don't support that way of life. The mission is Hamas is not limited to Israel. It's a worldview I disagree with. Wait, what? What are you talking about? Hamas's mission is to take back the Holy Land. And not only is that not possible, but it's also not correct. Speaking of Hamas, actually, before I have Mohammed Al-Safin on today, here, he sent me this video to watch. What does Hamas actually want? This is actually a decent video. So we'll start off with what does Hamas actually want?
In December 1987, on a strip of Mediterranean coast overcrowded with refugees, a group calling itself the Islamic Resistance Movement was founded. Its goal was simple. It wanted to liberate historic Palestine. Until 1948, the majority of the people living there were Palestinian, but 750,000 of them were driven from their homes, never allowed to return. At least 450 of their towns and villages were emptied, and in their place, the State of Israel was founded. In 1967, Israel occupied the remaining parts of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and it was in Gaza that Hamas was born. Hamas grew out of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which had initially focused on charity work and education rather than confronting Israeli occupation. The PLO is recognized by the UN as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, but in December 1987, without PLO input, a mostly unarmed uprising, known as the First Intifada, began against Israel in Gaza and the West Bank. Hamas declared its existence 2 days into this rebellion. It's worth taking a moment here to address something. Because Hamas has an Islamic identity and Israel proclaims itself a Jewish state, a lot of people claim its animosity towards Israel is based on anti-Semitism. But Coney says that's not accurate.
This is a fundamental misreading of Hamas and of Hamas's politics. It has not employed tactics that are grounded in anti-Semitism or that necessarily fight against Israeli Jews because of their Judaism. So when we think about Hamas...
Like, people constantly talk about the charter, the 1988 charter, and there is like a ton of anti-Semitic shit in there. Yeah, 100%. Just that you have to look at their popularity at the time, and even with respect to their actions, okay? Even with respect to their actions, like what the Palestinian people think is very different than what Hamas is doing and what Hamas is saying. But as far as their charter goes, 2017, there's a revamp on the charter that says, no, we are not anti-Semitic. Even before that charter, you have like, what is it? Not Yahya Sinwar, the Sheikh Yassin himself talking about how like, oh, we don't hate Jews at all. We just want to have our land back. We want to have our homes back or whatever. But ultimately, this isn't to do like propaganda to defend Hamas or to do PR for Hamas at all. The point is to better understand what these people's motivations are. Because the one side wants to say, no, they're terrorists. Don't listen. This is all terrorism. This is all terrorism. And the real reason for why this is said is specifically because if you conflate Hamas's goals, some of which are legitimate, which is, of course, resistance to the Israeli occupation. Like Hamas militants right now and Palestinian militants in general right now are engaging in a defensive act as the Israeli occupying force is pummeling Gaza. Right now, they're not doing terrorism. Every single thing that they're doing, well, most of the things that they're doing, because like you still can't take hostages and stuff like that, but most of the things that they're doing, the overwhelming majority of the things that they're doing currently are not an act of terrorism. Israel is the one that is doing terrorism at this moment. So that's something to remember, right? They are defending what remains of the sliver of land from an occupying force that is a belligerent occupier that is actually indiscriminately destroying both the civilian infrastructure but also civilian lives in general. 18,000 Palestinians have died so far in the hands of Israel. But the reason why people say, no, Hamas are anti-Semitic, they are worse than the Nazis, they're just like the Nazis, they're worse than the Nazis, they just want to kill all Jews, they're not operating with any kind of like real reason other than indiscriminate hatred towards Jews, they're rapists, barbarians and whatnot. The reason why people say that is because they want to conflate the actual things that Hamas is doing. Not all of them are good, but the good things that Hamas are doing or the moral things that Hamas are doing, like defending the Gaza Strip from the Israeli occupying force, which is the truth, which is both legally permissible and also morally righteous and just. I will stand on that. But because it's Hamas that's doing it and they're terrorists, they shouldn't have a right to do that. That's what the real reason why people say this and cast this broad brush is specifically so that you in the Western world don't look at this and go, but wait a minute, like, aren't they kind of doing the correct thing in this moment? Does that make sense?
Discussing the liberation of Palestine, what it means for the movement is dismantling a system of colonial violence.
This was also addressed by Hamas's founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin.
He says we don't hate the Jews and fight them because they're Jews. They are people of religion and we are people of religion. If my brother, who has the same religion and parents as me, takes my home and expels me from my land, I will fight him.
In 2017, the group addressed this in its updated charter, we'll get to that later, saying, quote, Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish.
Yeah, this is when they were trying to, they ended up having to take on civil governance duties, not dissimilar to the Taliban right now in Afghanistan, after years and years and years of just like simply being a militant force. And when you have to do that, all of a sudden, the situation and the calculation changes. Now you have to take care of 2 million people. Obviously, this is, yeah, Hamas goes woke in this moment when they have to change their structure almost entirely.
But wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. The First Intifada ended with the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO. The PLO gave up its claim to historic Palestine, renounced violence, and recognized the State of Israel. In exchange, a Palestinian Authority run by the PLO would have limited autonomy over some parts of the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The right of return for refugees would be discussed in future negotiations that were meant to lead to a Palestinian state in just the West Bank and Gaza. While many Palestinians saw this as a hopeful moment, others felt that the PLO had given up too much for too little. Hamas was among those opponents, and its members were persecuted by both Israel and the PA.
Yeah.
But its opposition wasn't just verbal. Hamas's military wing.
Another thing that people need to understand here is that the Palestinian peace process that people love to talk about, to say like, oh, dude, classic Palestinians just like were giving great deals over and over again, and then they never took it because they're stupid and they're violent barbarians. And it's like, that's not the truth at all. Every single instance of this peace process, one, starts and ends with the fact that you are trying to make peace with an occupier that is occupying your land. So it's already like the starting position already is bad. And some of the major points of consideration are non-starters for the occupying side, like a right to return or having a standing military. So it wasn't simply territorial disputes. It was straight up a non-starter that Palestinians would have any kind of sovereignty or any kind of autonomy in a two-state solution. This, of course, is ridiculous. Like, under no circumstances whatever would you ever say that that is a valid peace process, that this was like a reasonable peace process where the Israeli government was making genuine concessions.
Is known as the Izz al-Din al-Qassam Brigades.
When Hamas constituted itself in 1987 as the movement we understand today, it re-emerged through the social infrastructure as a military movement. So it began amassing weapons in order to commit to resisting Israel.
After an American-Israeli settler killed 29 Palestinians at a mosque in Hebron, Hamas responded with what would become its signature tactic for the next decade, a suicide bomb.
Yeah. So originally Hamas did not strike at Israeli civilians. And originally, even Hamas did not utilize suicide bombing in general. I believe that they kept their practice to. And remember, this is at this point they are still a marginal militia force that does not represent the interests of the Palestinian population. Remember, Palestinians are not going, oh, we love Hamas, they're the best. Only recently, after the worst aspects of the 75-year occupation, or specifically the peace process falling apart deliberately on behalf of the more right-wing factions and even like the centrist factions within Israel, genuinely propping up Hamas as the only force to negotiate with. And by the way, if you don't believe me, Listen to a former Shin Bet leader describe this in identical terms that I have time and time again, or listen to Netanyahu's own words that came out recently this past weekend, where he said he deliberately destroyed any attempt of Palestinians ever having a nation state and casting aside the Oslo Accords, right? Or saying that he would always hold back on the Oslo Accords. Like things that he has said time and time again, but he has reiterated recently. In that process, even throughout that entire timeline, even though the Israeli government was basically trying to prop up a militant faction so that they could say, look, these Palestinians are all violent, we can't negotiate with them, they can never have a state, thinking that they can continue this occupation in the way that they have as an apartheid state, the Palestinian population did not ever show broad popular support to both the military actions, the militant actions, or even Hamas as Hamas in general.
Deadlier and more dramatic than shooting soldiers, these attacks had two goals. One was the disruption of the Oslo Accords. And two, by expanding its targets to include Israeli civilians, Hamas hoped it would pressure the Israeli government to end the occupation.
This, by the way, is what Rashid Khalidi has said was a mistake. The attacks on the Israeli civilian population would only end up hardening the position of the Israeli population as a whole, and that time and time again it was shown that, according to him at least, and according to what's the Pakistani guy that worked with the FLN, Ahmad, what was his name? Iqbal Ahmed, the Pakistani political scientist, writer, academic, who had offered tactics to the Palestinian liberation, saying that it was, who said this was a mistake? The Pakistani political scientist, writer, academic, Iqbal Ahmad, who served in the Pakistan military, but then also I believe worked in Tunisia and Algeria and supported the revolution in Algeria that was brought in at the time by the Palestinian militancy or the Palestinian resistance groups to take a look at their tactics. And Iqbal Ahmad, contrary to what they thought he was going to say, told them that given the nature of the Israeli population, that tactics that normally would cause terror upon a civilian population would not work in this circumstance. He was not killing civilians, mind you, in an active. He had said that given the nature of the Israeli population, attacks upon civilians would only cause galvanization on the Israeli front, and it would cause Israelis to harden their position and become even more militant and more reactionary, and that it was not an effective tactic, which of course is understandable considering the difference between, for example, even the Jewish population in Algeria and the Christian population and even the Muslim population in Algeria that collaborated with the French authorities and worked alongside the French colonialists, and how the violence that they were subjected to was only successful in Algeria because they had somewhere to go. They could go back to France. There are a lot of Israelis who have nowhere to go. So do Israelis, though? That's not true. You're not right about that. No, I know that everybody loves saying so do Israelis. That's not true. And this is not my perspective. This is the perspective of a dude who literally has studied terrorism and freedom fighting, and has actually literally participated in acts of terrorism and freedom fighting. So I don't know what the fuck you want. You're talking about a dude who worked with Frantz Fanon, an Algerian nationalist, and you're like, I don't care about his perspective. Like, it's not my perspective, it's his perspective. I'm just repeating it to you. Wait, I lost the script. You've acted in acts of terror? No, I'm talking about an academic and a scholar. Suicide bombings essentially never work to achieve ultimate aims. They just essentially have a psychological impact on the local population for a certain period of time. All it led to was the conduction of a West Bank border wall and the expansion of settlements. No, I don't think it was suicide bombings that expanded the settlements. That's not correct. I will not say that at all. No. Suicide bombings hardened the position of the Israeli population to become even more reactionary against Palestinians in general, certainly. But the idea that they are like the reason why West Bank settlements expanded is not correct. The settlements are complete Messianic Judaism, expansionist protocols from Israel because they want to expand into the West Bank and have total control from the river to the sea, as also openly stated in the Likud Charter as well. There's a material reason for it, but then also beyond that, there's also religious, they sell it from a religious perspective too. But it's not because like the Palestinians did suicide bombings and that's why it happened. Anyway.
But these tactics were controversial, even amongst Palestinians and even within Hamas itself.
So there was a lot of discussion internally amongst Palestinians about the morality of targeting civilians. Of course, under international law, targeting civilians is illegal. However, the Palestinians were operating in a reality where the violence of the apartheid structure itself was targeting civilians day in, day out with no accountability. And
how are you not in jail if you did terrorism? I didn't do the terrorism, man. I'm talking about the dude who was like a scholar of successful terror tactics. Also, you want to know how a terrorist doesn't go to jail? When they win and become the government. The idea that like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter is unironically correct. It is correct. Look at the IRA. Look at the ANC in South Africa. Look at the IRA in Ireland. Some of the leadership did actually serve prison sentences with their direct participation in acts of violence against the civilian population, which will 100% happen if there was a Truth and Reconciliation Committee for Hamas as well, and Hamas leadership as well, 100%, alongside, of course, the Israeli occupying force too. But yeah, again, FLN in Algeria, like these are all acts of terror until they're not. Our founding fathers were terrorists, technically.
Hamas at the time believed that inflicting at least some damage on Israeli civilians was a way of deterrence.
But when a second intifada broke out in 2000, Hamas and other groups deployed dozens of suicide bombers, killing more than 1,000 Israelis. Instead of deterrence, these attacks gave Israel cover as it decimated Gaza and the West Bank, killing more than 4,900 Palestinians. After that uprising died down in early 2005, Hamas pretty much abandoned suicide bombings, but it didn't abandon armed opposition to Israeli occupation. And the next few years would see the group evolve in major ways, both militarily and politically. From its founding to the end of the Second Intifada, Hamas had been an opposition movement, but as the Palestinian Authority's negotiations with Israel failed to create a Palestinian state, or even stop Israel from building more settlements, Hamas's popularity grew. The US, European Union, and Israel consider the group to be a terrorist organization, but the UN and most other countries do not, and soon Hamas would become the central actor in resistance to Israel. From a small fighting force to a guerrilla army. From rebels to rulers. How did that happen? In 2005, Israel disengaged from Gaza and pulled its settlers and soldiers out. Israel claimed it was now no longer responsible for the people who lived in Gaza. But the withdrawal didn't end the occupation. Israel still dominated the territory.
But the ANC only killed 52 civilians and 19 security forces during their entire operation? Yeah. Also, their entire operation started becoming more violent in 1967, right? And basically fizzled out and ended in its entirety when the apartheid ended. What you fail to consider is that the Israeli apartheid started before and has continued to this day. And the numbers on the Israeli side, as far as like the amount of death and destruction upon a civilian population, is also higher. HasanAbi, Real Desert Rat says, HasanAbi is biased. He is Arab. Question, how are Jews occupiers, Hasan? Why do we ignore history? Well, this is my favorite type of like defender of Israel who just goes, dude, your name is Hasan. You're biased because you're Arab. First of all, there are plenty of Arab Jews too, and I'm not Arab. I'm Turkish. You, on the other hand, are a dumbass. Not only are you a dumbass because you don't understand how Jews, not Jews by the way, Israel is the occupying force here. Just like you don't understand that I am not Arab, nor am I biased specifically towards Palestinians because of my background, but I'm biased for Palestinian emancipation because I'm always going to be biased towards freeing people from occupying forces unconditionally. Hasan, where did the name Palestine come from then? Oh my God, bro. There is no justification that you can offer to occupying 5 million Palestinians and denying 6 million Palestinians a right to return to their ancestral homes in permanent refugee status in regional states, in neighboring regional Arab states, because you were there 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Real Desert Rat is his name. I don't know why this is his name. I don't care when the name Palestine was given. Just like I don't give a shit when like new, old, ancient Jewish artifacts are unearthed in a cave or some shit. It's myth making. It's dumb as
territory from the outside, controlling borders, trade, telecommunications, the sky, the sea. But the settlements were gone. So Hamas, which had been attacking the Gaza settlements and military bases, saw it as a vindication. In its view, armed resistance was the way to get rid of Israeli settlements. In 2006, looking to play a bigger role in Palestinian politics, Hamas took part in Palestinian Authority legislative elections. This was a big change. Hamas had boycotted the previous elections, saying elections under Israeli occupation were part of the Oslo process it opposed. Now, it claimed that the collapse of Oslo meant things were different. And to many people's surprise, it beat President Mahmoud Abbas's ruling Fatah party in both Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, it wasn't actually surprising to the Fatah party that this was going to happen, ironically, because they were the ones who told George W. Bush not to conduct this. They were the ones who told George W. Bush, who wanted to in 2000, in one of his like acts in his administration, was that he was going to fuck up the whole Palestinian situation too.
The challenge facing the United States is that we have to be right one time. I mean, 100% of the time.
And his allies on the Palestinian side were obviously the CIA-backed Fatah. They told him, do not conduct this election. We are not ready. We are not seen by the Palestinian population as a good force. Because at this point, Israel was already utilizing the PA as a part of its security apparatus. They were arresting Palestinian leaders. They were collaborating with the Israeli occupying force. So the Palestinian population saw them as corrupt figureheads that were also enacting brutality upon the Palestinian population at the behest of Israel. They lost the election. They knew that they were going to lose it. Hamas ran on an anti-corruption ticket where they were like, listen, guys, we're Islamists. Like, sure, we're resisting against Israel militarily, but also on top of that, like, we are 100%. We're the uncorrupted new guys in the room. Please vote for us. They want a plurality. They never got the same majority governing mandate that Yasser Arafat had gotten in the first elections ever conducted, obviously. They simply got the plurality. They won over Fatah by a margin of 3%. Okay, they had 3 points on Fatah, which was not the majority, but simply the plurality. I love you, though. I agree with you on most, just not about ethnic Jews being removed from their homeland throughout history. Makes no sense as to how Israelis are occupiers then. Brother, this is a ridiculous point to make. You cannot make this point. If Mongolians came and took over like the entire area that they previously used to occupy, you would go, that's nuts. That's an insane thing to do. Of course, you never have to imagine that because that's never going to happen. Even if Native Americans, like, which they don't even advocate for, land back does not mean violently ripping people from their homes. The notion that like Native Americans can now just do Israel shit to the American population would be ridiculous. The irony, of course, is the Ashkenazi Jews themselves coming from Europe do not have a genetic ancestry that is ironically traced back to early Judea and Samaria. However, the Palestinian Muslims, on the other hand, and the Palestinian Christians who converted do. So you are, and by the way, I'm not saying that there aren't any Jews living in Israel right now that can like trace their genes back to ancient Israel, okay, or what you think is ancient Israel. But the irony is that you are literally killing people who have converted throughout time that stayed there instead of left. That is blood and soil politics, but it's also incorrect. He loves you and is a fan, but thought you were Arab. Yeah, I know. Lamau, and you're not even saying that Ashkenazi Jews can't live in Palestine and Israel. You've only said that Palestinians and Israelis should have equal rights in a secular state. I fail to see what's so controversial about that. It's not. It's not even remotely controversial if you are looking at it from a human rights perspective. It's only controversial if you factor in Israel's own demographic concerns as an apartheid state and the national security problems that they face if they are no longer able to maintain an apartheid state.
Rather than respect the results of the democratic election, the U.S., supported by Israel, decided to engage in a regime change operation. So essentially it began to facilitate for a coup to prevent Hamas from emerging as a governing authority that was democratically elected.
Israel arrested enough of the newly elected Hamas members in the West Bank to prevent the legislature from functioning, while in Gaza, months of deadly street fighting between Abbas's US-backed security forces and Hamas loyalists left hundreds of people dead.
Yeah.
Until June 2007, when the Qassam brigades routed the security forces and expelled them from Gaza.
Yeah.
Within 2 years, Gaza had gone.
This was a major American up, by the way, which is pretty funny because, like, we forget. I know everyone's always like, Hasan, you say America bad, America bad. Like, this literally happened because of America. This was the Bush administration overstepping their own regional actors in the Palestinian Authority at the time to literally say, at the top of the hour, there's a 3-minute ad break and we're serving it, dog.
Gone from being controlled by the Israeli military to being controlled by Hamas.
Now, in response, Israel tightened a blockade that had already been placed on the Gaza Strip in different iterations in the past. And in its initial thinking, Israel used the blockade as a punitive tool, really to punish the Palestinians and to try to force them to bring down Hamas as a governing authority.
The blockade has had a huge impact on Gaza, with 80% of its factories shutting down since it began. Unemployment is at least 46%, and travel, fuel, electricity, and medical aid have all been restricted. But isolating Gaza like this also served other Israeli goals. For a long time, Israeli governments have wanted to remove Gaza's population from the country's demographic equation.
And getting rid of this demographic problem would allow Israel to maintain itself as a quote-unquote Jewish majority state.
That's because when you include Gaza's population, there are actually as many, if not more, Arabs living under Israeli rule as there are Jews. But to keep Gaza separate, Israel has relied on what Bakoni calls a violent equilibrium with Hamas. Here's how it worked. When conditions in Gaza have become especially difficult, Hamas has often fired rockets at Israel. The response has often been a massive Israeli assault, after which a ceasefire is negotiated and some restrictions lifted for a while. There have been several major assaults in 2008 and 2009, 2012, 2014, and in 2021, which have killed more than 4,000 people in Gaza. On the Israeli side, less than 100 people were killed. Israeli officials have referred to this endless cycle of siege and violence as mowing the grass. Back in 2012, the UN warned that unless the blockade was lifted, Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020. Meanwhile, with Gaza separated from the West Bank, Israel had a freer hand to expand its illegal settlements over there. For the sake of the millions living under its rule, and for its goal of ending Israeli colonization and occupation, Hamas looked for a solution. A 2017 deal saw Hamas actually give up some of the ministries it was running, with the PA taking over, although Hamas has always kept exclusive security control in Gaza.
But all forms of dealing with the political reality around the Gaza Strip were opposed by Israel.
In an attempt to gain more international legitimacy and create some diplomatic openings, Hamas updated its charter in 2017. The new charter produced a significant development in the group's thinking. While it still hoped to liberate all of historic Palestine, Hamas accepted that a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank, along with the return of refugees to their homes, was a solution that Palestinians could agree on. Now, this is in line with the policies of many countries around the world who want to see a two-state solution.
Now, for the Western policymaking community, this did not go far enough, but the movement certainly provided significant ways in which it could engage in diplomacy with Western powers. And instead of engaging with that, Western powers decided to maintain a blockade on Hamas.
A year later, Hamas backed a massive, almost 2-year-long protest called the Great March of Return on Gaza's eastern boundary with Israel. Every Friday, thousands of Palestinians marched unarmed to the fence, demanding the right to return to their ancestral homes.
Israel's response was to portray these popular marches as...
How do I respond to people saying Al Jazeera is not reputable because they're funded by Qatar? All media entities have biases, especially state media, and you just have to look at the actual facts that they are delivering. I mean, I spend a shitload of time looking at literally right-wing sources and even Israeli sources that are on the left, Israeli sources that are on the right. I spend a shit ton of time looking at all matter of different sources, but it doesn't change the factually accurate information that they're delivering or the information that they're conveying. You have to look beyond simply the biases from media outlets. You have to also look at the actual information that they're delivering. And on this issue, like if you ask someone in Al Jazeera like what their perspective is on, I don't know, slave labor in Qatar, obviously that is going to be very different in their coverage. But if you ask their perspective on this, it's correct. I don't ever go, BBC is British media. I will never listen to what they have to say. I always use BBC in my coverage. I use American sources in my coverage as well. I even look at Fox News regularly.
A form of terrorism, and they employed snipers hidden in sand dunes around the Gaza Strip, which targeted civilians, medics, and journalists.
214 Palestinians were killed and 36,000 injured, but
the popular mobilization resulted in very basic coverage globally and no concessions at all from Israel.
Speaking to an Italian newspaper that year, Hamas's leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, who spent 22 years in Israeli jails before being released in a 2011 prisoner swap, said he was hoping for a long-term ceasefire that would end the siege. If you know war, you don't want war, he said. I'm not saying I won't fight anymore. I'm saying I want no more wars. I want the end of the siege.
All the tactics that Hamas has employed, whether diplomatic or popular, have not been met with any kind of concession or even engagement from either the Israeli authorities or from the international community.
Instead, as the occupation and blockade became more entrenched and human rights groups declared Israel was committing apartheid against Palestinians, Israeli leaders felt little pressure to change course. Hamas seemed contained. If it did fight, Israel's defense technology kept its losses manageable. The West Bank and Gaza were now separated for a generation, and the Palestinian cause seemed like it was dying. The US was focused on building alliances between Arab countries and Israel, even as Israeli elections brought fascists to power. On September 29, 2023, the US National Security Advisor said,
"And the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades."
8 days later, Hamas fighters broke out of Gaza, launching the attack that changed all of that. So, is this the end of Hamas? After 35 years of fighting Israel, building a political program, evolving into a ruling government, and attempting to break the siege, has the group signed its own death warrant? That seems to be what Israel and its supporters believe, although 2 months into the fighting, there wasn't much evidence of Hamas collapsing. But can Israel's ferocious bombing actually eliminate violent resistance from an oppressed community?
More than anything else, the movement, Hamas, is an ideology.
Whatever you think of its tactics, Hamas's popularity and its primary reason for existing is because of its fight against Israeli occupation.
No one is like, oh, dude, I love anti-Semitism. I'm such a big fan of anti-Semitism. That's why I love Hamas, which I believe will do anti-Semitic things. Like, that's not the case. And if you say that, you're technically wrong. But the unfortunate reality is, as I've mentioned before, the unfortunate part about this is that it doesn't matter what the reality is. What matters is what most people believe. And unfortunately, when you are more engaged with manufacturing consent rather than assessing the situation on the ground, you're going to arrive at the consensus, especially in the Western world, being the exact opposite of what the reality is on the ground. You will never be able to figure out the intention and the motivations behind what the Palestinian people are doing. I personally think that this is obviously deliberately done so that people don't recognize Palestinian emancipation as a real just cause. But it's one that is important for everyone here, at least, to understand. Because if you want to eradicate Hamas, if you want to rob Hamas of its power, then you have to end the apartheid. Because when you look at the Palestinian population, and they are polled quite regularly, routinely they say they do not appreciate Hamas's civil governance. They also think Hamas is corrupt. Maybe not as corrupt as the Palestinian Authority, but they don't like it either. The only way to change that dynamic, the only way to change that outcome, the only way to get the Palestinians to be like, all right, well, we want better leadership, is by eradicating the necessity for Hamas to exist.
Commitment to liberation through armed struggle is not going to go anywhere as long as the Palestinian people exist.
Clearly, there won't be a return to the status quo before October 7th, 2023. But breaking that status quo is exactly what Hamas intended when it carried out such a devastating attack.
The only way that Israel can get any form of calm or security is if it begins dealing with the Palestinian people, not through a military lens, but rather through a political lens, to see and acknowledge
exactly what I've been saying.
The political demands at the heart of the Palestinian Liberation Project, the most fundamental of which is the right of return of Palestinian refugees who have been expelled from homes now within Israel.
On that note, I am going to have the senior producer of this piece, Mohammed Al-Safin, on the broadcast. He is a Al Jazeera producer. He's been on Chapo Trap House as well. I'm giving him a call right now. Hopefully he can pick up.
Yo. Hey, Hasan. How's it going, man?
All right. It's going all right. How about yourself? How are you doing?
I'm good. It's nice to be on with a fellow Arab.
Oh, yeah. I'm Turkish, which is what I don't know if you were watching.
I know. Yeah, I was.
Yeah, someone was saying that I'm obviously biased because I'm Arab. All right, so you won't be able to see me, but you can hear me, and if you're watching the stream, you can see me there, I guess. But I'm just gonna pop you in here. Here's Mohammed Al-Safin, or Al-Safin. Sorry, how do I say your?
You actually had it right the first time.
Oh, it's Al-Safin.
Al-Safin.